our last video, we talked about Andrew Jackson and his war on the Central Bank of the United States, and then how he implemented a spoil system of pet banks that eventually caused some really bad bank runs and panics for the next few decades, until it got bad enough that we made a new central bank called the Federal Reserve in 1913. Now, this didn't fix everything, and we're about to talk about some of the real early problems that the Federal Reserve has in the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression is highly debated. There's a lot of argument concerning who's at fault, how it happened, why it was so long, all of that. I don't want to get too deep into that. I just want to talk about three aspects of it that we need to know about. The first one is the credit, the implementation of credit into the consumer society of the United States, and the stock market. What happened with that? The next aspect I want to look at, it's very important to this crisis and every crisis afterward, is unemployment. And then finally, I want to take a look at some of the government intervention that was going on with the president and with the Federal Reserve at the time that all of this is happening. So, let's take a look. Now, what everyone will tell you about the Great Depression is that the stock market crashed and it ruined the economy for the next decade. Well, that doesn't even sound like it makes sense, and it's only a real small part of the problem of how we got into this situation. Most of it has to do with credit, and we're going to talk about that. And then the stock market does play a very huge role in what happened. So let's look a little deeper into it. The Federal Reserve was implemented in 1913. World War I broke out in 1914, and the U.S. entered a few years later. This changed the economy of the world forever, and the Federal Reserve being extremely young, this is the first challenge that they have to deal with. And they have a very controlled market. The entire United States economy is dedicated to the war effort. We have rationed materials. This means that certain types of metal you couldn't find. If you had it, then you could give it to the government for the war effort to make munitions, weaponry, armor, whatever they needed for the war effort. So they would only ration certain types of material out to the public, so their scarcity was pretty high, and this led to high inflation during the war because material is scarce. Certain things you cannot find, so when you do find them, the price of them is pretty high. Another thing that was going on during World War I was we were trying to fund the war effort with taxes, but we were also selling war bonds. Now, these bonds you would buy, and that money would go to the war, and then it would mature and you would get your money back later after the war was finished. This creates the market for the stock market. People are already investing and buying in these things and seeing them mature and getting their money back. So now you just need to package a different type of product and sell it to the same people that would invest. Another thing that we're seeing is women working. All of the men are off at war, so the women are in the factories and they're in the marketplace doing jobs that they hadn't done before. They really like doing it. After the war, they're going to continue doing it, and they're going to have money to spend, which means you're going to have a greater consumer base. Then the ultimate nail in the coffin, the thing I blame the Great Depression on, is the Treaty of Versailles, because we like to think of the United States and study its history, but world history is just as important, and what was going on after the war ended, the treatment of Germany and the stipulations of the treaty made it inevitable that there was going to be a depression and inevitable that there was going to be a second war. The aftermath of the Great War, World War I, was horrific in Europe. The countries that participated had entire cities destroyed, their infrastructure damaged to where it just needed to be rebuilt from scratch. The loss of human life was exponential compared to the US's contribution at the end of the war. And they were in shambles. The entire continent, everyone that had participated, needed to rebuild their countries. The United States didn't really have that issue. We didn't have any of our cities bombed. We didn't have any fighting on our land. Our infrastructure was intact the same way it was when we joined the war. So the United States jumped straight into a manufacturing economy. New products were being pumped out, one after another. Vacuum cleaners, blenders. We have electricity in the house now. There's appliances that make life a lot easier, and there's huge demand for these. These are things that had never been around before. They didn't exist before. So the newest and brightest and shiniest thing, you just had to have it. And this ramped up consumer spending. So you have supply and you have high demand. This is going to make the economy go quickly. Now, this is where the implementation of credit comes in, because everybody had to have these products, but not everybody could afford these products. So, with the economy booming like it is, the Federal Reserve leaves the interest rate really low so banks can lend out money to whoever they want. It's really easy to get credit. So if you can't afford something, you start doing installment payments, which means you put a little bit of money down and then you pay monthly as it goes. Well, this lets you have a little bit of extra savings in your pocket because you don't have to buy everything outright. So you start to think, what am I going to do with this? I already have a car. I'm not going to buy that. I already have a house. I'm making payments on that. All of my friends are getting rich in the stock market, so I'm going to start investing too. And everyone is investing. Shoe shiners are doing it. Drivers are doing it. Just the normal, everyday Joe is going to get in on the stock market because it is giving these unbelievable returns, and stocks are soaring. The people that have the money and the people that know what they're doing are playing the stock market. They're buying the stocks that they want and then dumping them when they know that the other people are going to do it. There's a lot of insider trading that's going on. But the country overall is booming. It is doing really well. But this boom is based on this credit, on this borrowed money. So the stock market is doing extremely well. But let's take a look at this ball of credit and just how malicious it is going to become. Because as the economy is booming and as the stock market is raging, the banks are having a field day. The Federal Reserve made a major mistake in just keeping the interest rate low and letting banks do whatever they want. Now, remember we talked about earlier that when the interest rate is low, the banks don't have that much of a reserve that they have to have at the end of the night so they can lend out more money. Well, that's what they did. Since they didn't have to report all of these reserves, then they lent out money, and they lent out a lot of it. This is the credit that we talked about. If people couldn't afford something, they would go to the bank, they'd get a loan, and then they would go and buy it and make payments. But the stock market is doing really well. It's doing so well that you can go to the bank and you can borrow money, and then you can take that borrowed money and put it into the stock market, and then get your return, and then go and pay the bank off with the profits that you made. It's genius. There's no work involved in it, but that's where it gets scary. You can also buy stocks on credit. You can put down a certain percentage, like say 10% of what the entire stock cost, and then promise to make payments on it later. Well, as long as the stock market is paying you, those payments are really easy to make. Not so much if it takes a turn for the worse. Now, investors aren't the only ones doing this, because the banks don't have any type of major reserve that they have to do. The interest rate is so low, they have a lot of money to play with. So whatever money they have left over, they invest in the stock market too. They go out and they buy stocks, and they buy stocks on margin. So they take their customers' money and they go and invest it into the stock market on a stock that they're not even buying all of it. They're buying it on margin and promising to pay it back later. So they borrowed the money to get a loan on a stock. It's very, very dangerous what they are doing. And it is going to implode, because all it takes is a certain amount of people not being able to pay for this cycle of good to stop and to turn into something that's bad. So we know about the panics and the way that people are thinking about banks and thinking about money. So as soon as the stock market turns and crashes, that's when the panic begins. People run on the bank. They try to get their money out. Cash payments are suspended. Banks go bankrupt. They have to shut their doors and default on all of their debts. And this cycle just keeps on continuing. The credit crisis and the stock market crash were bad enough by themselves, but the thing that really drove the Great Depression, the thing that made it as deep and as bad as it was the unemployment. The crash and people running out of money caused a lot of layoffs, and then that caused another cycle to start. So let's look at this. So the crash destroys consumer confidence, and when that happens, people stop buying things. They panic, they freeze, they don't have money. A lot of people lost everything overnight, so production slowed down. Well, they had to lay people off or had to cut their hours, so they didn't have money to spend on products or goods and services. Now, because they're not spending that money, then whoever's producing them, their job gets cut now. So they get fired from work because they're not needed for production. Well, that causes them not to buy any goods or services, and the next person down the line gets fired or gets laid off or has their hours cut, and then so on and so forth. It just keeps on compounding until there's millions of people out of work. This causes a cycle of deflation, constantly dropping prices because nobody can buy anything. The unemployment gets worse and worse. It finally goes up to about 28% or even higher. Most textbooks are going to tell you it's like they're somewhere around 20 to 23, but we know that the unemployment rate cannot be trusted. It is a horrible way to gauge unemployment in the country, There's so many people during the Great Depression that were falling under the category of discouraged workers, and they're not included in the unemployment rate. They are just fed up. They're not going to stand in line all day long to not get a job for years on end. So I think it's closer to 30, or it could even be higher than that. We will never know, but that compounding of people being laid off led to the deflation, and the deflation led to more people being laid off. Last thing we're going to look at is some of the responsibility that the federal government has for actions that they took that could have made this a little bit worse. So let's look at those. The first thing that the government did in intervening in this situation is they didn't rein in the Federal Reserve with their mismanagement of the interest rate. And hindsight is 2020, and with what we know now, if they would have raised the interest rate up and raised the reserve requirement, made credit harder to obtain, then a lot of these problems would have been prevented in the first place. But this is a new organization. They went through World War I as their learning experience, and they were dealing with the technologies and a market and a stock market that had never existed before. So they didn't know what was going to happen or how bad it could get. There were warning signs, but they weren't able to see that in the position that they're in. Or if they did see it, then it was too late to react. Our Depression era president is Herbert Hoover. He gets painted in a light of being a laissez-faire, hands-off the economy kind of a president. The textbooks will tell you that he did nothing to try to stop the depression from happening, and that's not accurate at all. He first makes a deal with major corporations like Ford to keep wages at the current levels that they are, to not give raises and not cut anybody's wages down, and this in turn, the workers will not strike. They won't demand better working conditions, and they won't demand higher wages. They're just going to ride through the crisis, get to the other side, and then start over from there. The other idea that he's implementing with these corporations and these businesses is not laying anybody off. Cut them down as far as you need to minimal part-time, but let them still have their job. This is not a function of the government. This is not a free market type of a policy either. This is a very Keynesian idea. The other thing that he's going to do is some major spending projects, some of the biggest projects in the United States. He's going to do the Hoover Dam, which is enormous. It employs a lot of people and a lot of materials. There's a lot of money spent on this. Also, the LA Aqueduct in California, bringing water to the city of Los Angeles. These are massive projects, massive government spending involved. The other thing he does is he raises taxes to try to get money to spend more money. Now, the international crisis is still going on with the Treaty of Versailles and the gridlock in Europe, hyperinflation happening in Germany because they can't pay off their war reparations. And he institutes the smoot-hawley tariff. And this is to try to make America's economy better by keeping jobs here, by keeping all of our money here. You're going to buy American products and you're not going to have to compete with anything from Europe because it's too expensive for them to sell here now. Well, these tariff policies are repeated. Europeans put tariffs on us, and it just makes the international depression way worse than it ever had to have been. Trade is really good for the economy, and when you do things to really hurt trade, then the economy is going to suffer from it. So we'll get into Roosevelt and his New Deal and how some of these policies very well could have extended the Depression way longer than it ever should have been. The government intervention in the economy where it just shouldn't be, pressing constitutional bounds to where the Supreme Court has to rein him in, and then he tries to even change the Supreme Court so he can do whatever he wants. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one. We're going to look at the OPEC oil crisis. We're going to look at the housing market crisis, and at the end of this we will take a look at comparing all of these to what's going on with the coronavirus today. So stick around. I'll see you next time.